How do disinformation ecosystems work? What are the key drivers? What role do people, power dynamics, and platforms play in shaping African disinformation systems? How can we develop effective countermeasures to mitigate the spread of disinformation and promote a healthy and resilient information ecosystem? In her Nobel acceptance speech in 2021, Filipino editor Rappler and forwarding the TED site, Maria Ressa said, "Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without trust, you have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with the existential problems of our times. Climate, coronavirus, now the battle for truth." Sacomm 2025, please welcome Professor Anmaya Mare.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Awesome. Thank you so much. First and foremost, I want to thank Jude and the local organizing team for inviting me to talk to you today. I also want to thank everybody who is here, who has come from different corners of the country, but also some coming outside of South Africa. Welcome to, we used to call it Port Elizabeth. That's what, the last time I was here, it was called Port Elizabeth. Now I know that it's got another name. Tlabeka. All right. Welcome. Thank you so much. For the next 40 minutes, I want to try and do a couple of things. But one of the key things that I want to try and do is to disentangle or to unpack what I call the black box of disinformation ecosystems in Africa. That is one of the key things that I want to try and do. But before I do that, I just want to prefix what I want to talk about by saying that we find ourselves in a very complex information ecosystem. On the one hand, the information ecosystem that we find ourselves has two things that are colliding with each other: the old logics of old media and also the new media that is trying to come into the picture and dislodge the old logics of old media. And with that, we have a very complex kind of an environment that we find ourselves in. Added to that layer is the issue of false and misleading information, which unfortunately have been weaponized by different actors, ranging from politicians, public relations consultants companies, pharmaceutical companies, environmental groups. There are so many people that have tried to weaponize these false and misleading narratives that we want to talk about today. But nonetheless, one thing that I just want to emphasize is to say that disinformation is not new. It is not new. It has just mutated into something much more complex, much more bigger, sometimes much more difficult to disentangle because of the way in which original content can actually be produced by artificial intelligence. And in this particular space that we find ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves in a space where the truth is struggling to surface to the top because it is competing with various kinds of narratives that are trying to shape our public opinion, but also shape the way how we interact with one another. And in that particular environment, we find ourselves in what other people call the polycrisis. And if we are talking about the polycrisis, we are talking about an amalgamation of different kinds of crises that are coming together, complicating our human existence. On the one hand, we've got the climate crisis. On the other hand, we have got various socio-economic crises that we've always had, but also conflicts that continue to become a threat to human existence. But on top of that, you then have what we call information disorder, or sometimes what we call disinformation, misinformation, depending on whatever term somebody decides to use. So in that particular environment, ladies and gentlemen, that is where I want to emphasize the need for us to create or to nurture what I call resilient and healthier information ecosystems? How do we do that in an environment where there are so many challenges? How do we make sure that we safeguard our information integrity? How do we make sure that we understand what is really happening? And in the next 40 minutes, as I've already pointed out, I want to take you through that memory journey to show you what exactly is happening, why we should care about what is happening, and what we can do so that we can be part of the solution. I'll jump this particular slide because I want to leave it a mystery in terms of what I want to do. So I'm not going to tell you the journey that I'm going to talk, but as I present, I think you will be able to get a gist of exactly where I'm coming from with this particular talk. Some would ask, why are you talking about the black box? Because the black box, as we all know, is this thing, whenever there's a plane crash, people are talking about the black box, right? We want to find where the black box is. We want to understand what really happened before the crash happened, and many things. But others that also write a lot in terms of the nexus between technology and society say we need to open what they call, we need to open the black box of technology. Because technology, in whatever form it is a black box that is oftentimes a mystery, it is a secret to us, and we need to be able to unpack this black box so that we can understand what really happens. So I have deliberately chosen this particular metaphor, knowing fully well that it hides, but it also illuminates. I also have chosen this particular metaphor, knowing fully well that there are so many mysteries about what really is happening with our disinformation ecosystems, especially in Africa. So many people asking questions. What really drives this? Whose interest does disinformation serve? And what can be done to make sure that we deal with the challenges that we find ourselves in? If you indulge me a little, I would probably take you through this particular slide, where again I say the black box is a complex system. It is a complex system by its nature, or a device whose internal workings are always hidden and not readily understood by the ordinary person. The ordinary person does not understand how do we find ourselves where we are. Why is it all of a sudden our information ecosystem is so laden with false and misleading information? Has this always been the case? When did it start? And what can we do to make sure that we deal with it? So that's where I'm trying to take this talk from and push it forward to say there is a lot that needs to be understood so that we can understand what really is happening. I'll just jump a bit and move on to this particular slide where I want to contextualize the current issues that we have been dealing with. And I think some of us that are in the room understand very well that disinformation has been actually chosen as one of the short-term global risks by the World Economic Forum. They said even if you look at climate change, it doesn't come close to what disinformation has become. Armed struggles cannot even come close to what disinformation has become, because disinformation has got a corrosive effect, but also a challenge that it can also divide societies. It can create divisions, polarization, but it also can make it very difficult for ordinary people to make informed decisions. And in that particular context, the World Economic Forum argues that disinformation should be seen as the topmost global risk that the world is facing, which means there's a lot that needs to be done to be able to deal with this particular issue. I also want to emphasize one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that disinformation is a wicked problem. It is a wicked problem of our time because of the capacity to make it very difficult for us to form informed public opinion about issues that we care. Be it health, be it environment, be it politics, be it just social relations, nation-building projects. It can complicate a lot. It's worse, especially in a conflict-ridden society. It is worse in a continent where there are lots of conflict. When you add a layer of disinformation in a context where there is a lot of conflicts, there is likely that we are likely to see a lot of challenges. And what I also argue is that disinformation is just a symptom of a complex problem that society is dealing with. It is a symptom of a complex problem, but also the same disinformation is an amplifier of these problems that we are dealing with as society. So there is a lot that we need to do in that particular regard. Ladies and gentlemen, while I have argued that disinformation is a challenge, let me hasten to say that disinformation has always been with us. In fact, other scholars argue that maybe disinformation is the latest reincarnation of what we used to call propaganda. And we have dealt with propaganda for a long, long, long time. And because of that, it becomes imperative for us to understand the continuities and discontinuities that are at the center of disinformation. Because once we run away from that, we run the risk of trying to deal with a problem that we have always dealt with, but maybe that it has taken a new garb. Now, all of a sudden, we see it as a different kind of a phenomenon. Ladies and gentlemen, the other issue that I also want to emphasize is to say that maybe we should guard against fetishizing disinformation, especially digital disinformation. Why do I say so? Because, as I've already pointed out, disinformation has always existed in earlier forms of media. West in Africa, where it has always existed in oral media, in terms of jokes, in terms of gossip, in terms of the ways in which we communicate through the word of mouth. Maybe the digital has only amplified its reach. Maybe the digital has only given its legs to stand on, but it has always been a problem. I also want to lean on the argument that has also been made by Robin Mansell in 2025 to say we also need to be wary of the Western bias, especially in the way in which we understand disinformation. Because most of the time, our conceptualization of disinformation tends to lean heavily on what I call Western understandings of disinformation. Our theoretical models also lean heavily on what we call Western theoretical gaze of what disinformation is. While there's nothing wrong from doing that, we run the risk of losing touch of understanding how does disinformation in an African ecosystem operate? How does it manifest itself? Who are the primary drivers of it? And what are their interests? And for me, that is the crucial challenge that we have as scholars. We need to open up the black box of disinformation to understand its arteries, its circuits, its roots, and what it tries to achieve. And for us, if we are able to do that, then we will be able to move the conversation further. The other thing that I also want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, is that disinformation has always been with us, especially in Africa. Pre-colonial, before the advent of colonialism, disinformation was there. It was there in various forms that it took. There were people that were called, in some societies, griots, bards, or now some which we'll probably call even some traditional leaders that were at the core of pushing these kinds of disinformation campaigns. So disinformation did not start with colonialism. It was always there. But the way in which we conceptualized it, because we used Western lenses to understand it, we lost touch to understand that it has always been part of us. But the other thing that I also want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, is that colonialism was a project of disinformation. Disinformation was part and parcel of colonialism. Colonialism was able to be nourished and sustained by disinformation. So disinformation logics were at the center of colonialism as a project. We cannot understand modern day disinformation without understanding its past, its present, and its future iterations. It's very important to understand the triad in terms of the connections that connects these things together. But over and above that, liberation movements like the ANC, ZANU-PF, Frelimo, they also used disinformation during their time, because it was a way of also coping with the disinformation that was coming from colonial governments. So they also mounted their own types of disinformation campaigns. So we have always had disinformation either weaponized by the powerful or also weaponized by the powerless. So there's nothing new about disinformation. That is my argument. But what I want to emphasize is that in present-day Africa, post-colonial governments, in some post-colonial governments, disinformation has been turbocharged through the use of state-owned media enterprises, be it broadcast television, be it radio stations, be it newspapers. We have seen disinformation being weaponized, turbocharged, recalibrated, and used again to suppress the truth, to hide the real nature of social relationship, to hide the nature of the real things that are happening in that particular environment. Then my argument is to say, maybe the digital has amplified disinformation. Maybe the digital has recalibrated disinformation. Maybe the digital has provided a fertile ground upon which we can make sense of disinformation. I'll probably try and jump this slide because I can always come back to it. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to talk about some of the problematic disinformation types that we are dealing with right now. I know since Brexit and also the 2016 elections in the US, there's been a lot of talk around disinformation. And unfortunately, we have been hot-spotted as Africans to also take on to that, to latch on to that particular moral panic, without looking at our own context to say, if disinformation is a problem during Brexit, is it also a problem in Africa? And if it is a problem in Africa, where does it rear its ugly head? Where does it manifest itself? And because of that, I want to talk about the main manifestations of disinformation that we have seen in the last couple of years in Africa that are very problematic. One is what we call health misinformation or health-related disinformation. I think COVID is an example of what we saw happening. But before COVID, for those that have been following the debates around HIV and AIDS, HIV and AIDS was also laden with a lot of disinformation. So many young girls were raped after Sangoma told somebody that if you sleep with a young virgin, you are going to be cured of HIV and AIDS. What is that? It is disinformation. Disinformation is always with us. We have examples of disinformation. Electoral disinformation is a big issue. Look at the last election that have been held since 2010 in Africa. From South Africa to Nigeria to Kenya, we have seen a lot of disinformation campaigns accompanying those particular elections. But over and above that, we have also seen very problematic disinformation around climate change. And most of it continues to happen, even up to this very day. But also, from time to time in Africa, we deal with what we call anti-foreigner disinformation. Some of it which starts online and then moves online to offline, and before you know it, there's xenophobic violence. Disinformation has always been part of our social fabric, ladies and gentlemen. It manifests at different historical moments, at different historical periods, because of the conducive environment in which that particular narrative is finding itself. But we've also been dealing with a lot with what I call conflict-related disinformation. Go to Rwanda, for example. Go to DRC, for example. Go to Central African Republic right now. Go to Cabo Delgado in Mozambique right now. There's a lot of conflict-related disinformation. A lot of it. And all that needs to be unpacked and understood to say what are the drivers and why are we finding ourselves in that particular mode. I just want to hasten to talk about this before I then make a clarion call in terms of what I see going forward. The dominant approach to understanding of disinformation has fallen into many pitfalls. I call them pitfalls. One of the pitfalls has been to understand disinformation from predominantly Western lenses. And because of that, we have failed to identify the solutions and interventions that are context-specific to our context. And for me, that is a challenge. That pitfall needs to be dealt with. The other pitfall that I also find very problematic is that we tend to borrow interventions and solutions from the global north, and I call that a copying and pasting pitfall. You have cancer, and you have not understood what kind of cancer you have. But we have heard that if you want to deal with cancer, you need chemotherapy. And you just borrow chemotherapy without understanding the kind of cancer that you're dealing with. And that is one of the challenges that we have as a continent. I have seen a lot of interventions, I'll talk about them, a lot of interventions that are being pushed. Some of them without understanding the context in which Africans consume, share, and engage with false news. And that is also very problematic. The other pitfall that we have fallen into is what I call treating disinformation as a wholly digital problem. Yes, big tech has to come to the party. But in Africa, disinformation is not only a digital phenomenon. It is not a digital phenomenon. Digital phenomenon is part of the problem, but beyond that, we need to understand our own information ecosystem and understand how do people share, consume, engage with content before we then diagnose the problem that we are dealing with. The other pitfall that we have fallen in is to assume that disinformation is a post-colonial manifestation. As I've argued, it has existed before where we find ourselves. And because of that, we have an historical understanding of disinformation in most of the works that we are dealing with, but also in terms of most of the things that we are dealing with right now. Then there's a stereotype. We also have got a stereotypical kind of a pitfall that we have fallen into. I call this a stereotype because we assume that Africans that are not connected to the internet are vulnerable to misinformation. For me, that is a stereotype. Ladies and gentlemen, people are not as dour as we want to think. They are not as dour. They are not as passive victims of disinformation as we think. We need to understand the sociology of how people engage with content. And when we do that, we then be able to understand that not having access or being in a low connective environment does not render you vulnerable to misinformation. I'll prefix it. I know so many people have questions, but I'll prefix it just now in terms of what I want to try and say. Let me jump this slide. These are just some of the examples I think that we've dealt with in the recent years. I think religious disinformation, I've not talked about religious disinformation, but we do have a lot of religious disinformation in this continent. A lot of it. A lot of it. And unfortunately, most of our people rely on religion to make sense of the world. They rely on religion to make sense of the world. And if you want to understand in African, mostly, you have to understand their spiritual world to understand how they process information, what they consider to be trustworthy sources. A religious pastor is more trustworthy than SABC to some people in Africa. And that's how complex our information ecosystem is. And we need to understand that. Types, I will probably not talk much about that because of time, but we've got a lot of foreign disinformation campaigns that are happening on this continent, and we know who are some of the major culprits that are involved in these kinds of disinformation campaigns, but we also have got a lot of domestic disinformation. But as I've already pointed out, we also have got online and offline variants of disinformation that we need to make sense of. So I know in my title, I brought people as one of the things that I want to talk about. Humans are at the center of disinformation campaigns. Humans are infrastructures of disinformation. They are infrastructures. They are able to circulate, to produce, to engage with disinformation, but also they are also targets of disinformation. So we need to understand the sociology of these people that are consumers on one hand, producers, distributors, but also amplifiers of disinformation. We need to understand them. But now it's even much more complex now, because as we see humans and machines becoming blurred, what others are calling actors and actants, the relationship between actors and actants is becoming much more blurred. And because of that, we are seeing with AI, for example, there's a lot of bots that are being used, deployed, and we are seeing a lot of misinformation being used. So a human being becomes a mediator, but also an intermediary of disinformation campaigns. We see with the recruitment of social media influencers in Africa, we see with the recruitment of what in Nigeria they call them propaganda secretaries. In Zimbabwe, I think they call them warakashi, which means, those people that are deployed to thrash others into submission, to dilute this information ecosystem. We are seeing a lot of these human beings being, recruited, supported, and sponsored by people that have money. So we also need to understand the political economy of disinformation. What are the interests of these people that are giving people money to spend the whole day on the keyboard, pushing narratives, diffusing narratives, distracting narratives? What do they tend to benefit from that? And it's very important for us to do that. But also we need to understand that this disinformation for hire people that we are talking about, there are people that are employed in what I call precarious labor. It is precarious labor. We also need to understand their working conditions. We need to understand them. How much do they get for a per day? How much do they get? Do they have also, support in terms of mental well-being? Because they are dealing with things that are not just easy. They need mental support in some of the things that they're dealing with. So we need to understand the whole ecosystem around these people. But also we have said there are so many foreign actors that are involved. I know some of you have heard about Tim Joge, Cambridge Analytica. The Wagner Group is very much active in Africa. So many public relations companies like Bell Pottinger, obviously in South Africa. We know what they did here in South Africa. I think you saw this went viral at some point. Disinformation is about practices, ladies and gentlemen. Ultimately, it is about practices. It is about practices. It is about a set of activities, rituals that people do make on a regular basis. And in Africa, we have seen that these kinds of practices are driven by certain kinds of agendas. And because we need to understand these agendas, we also need to understand the agents of the people that are behind these practices. Because practices and narratives that are being pushed to achieve certain kinds of objectives. For me, power is an important concept to use to make sense of disinformation. Ultimately, disinformation is about power, be it economic power, technological power, political power. All these kinds of power manifest and intersect in complex ways in the disinformation ecosystem. For instance, if you look at what has been happening around the use of what some call platform power, we are seeing a lot of disinformation campaigns being sponsored by politicians. We are seeing a lot of disinformation campaigns being sponsored by even foreign entities. For example, if you go to West Africa, for example, the challenge that they have right now, especially in the Coup Belt, is disinformation that is mostly coming from China, Russia, Turkey, to some extent Qatar, is involved, especially in Sudan, South Sudan. We are seeing all these global powers coming together to try and push narratives. But if you ask me, what kind of narratives are they trying to push? What do they want to achieve through this particular? So at the end of the day, the power to speak, the power to have a voice is about power. Voice without power is not voice. Voice is always accompanied by power. And we have seen that, especially on social media, that, for instance, algorithms have the power to render something visible or invisible. That is power. That is where platforms become very essential, to understand how do they make certain things more visible and other things less visible. They have the power to prioritize, but also they have the power to deprioritize. And that power to deprioritize, whose narratives are being deprioritized, and in most cases, divisive, false and misleading information is the one that becomes visible. Things that matter, that should be in the public interest, are rendered invisible and also deprioritized. And for me, that is an issue that needs to be understood. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've already pointed out, I have not tried to exonerate the role of platforms in the disinformation ecosystem. But I've said it's just part of the problem. Because the African information ecosystem is much broader than technology. It's much broader than just looking at big tech. Big tech, yes, but if you look at the numbers, how many Africans are on these platforms? And how many actually use these particular platforms on a daily basis? Probably you'll see half of the people are still not yet there. But also, we also need to understand that even though half of the people are not on these social media platforms, there is something very interesting about African ways of doing things, is that the thing that starts online, it moves online to offline through the word of mouth. So people share things that they've seen on Facebook through the word of mouth. So even though I'm not on WhatsApp, I am on WhatsApp indirectly. Even though I'm not on Facebook, I am on Facebook indirectly. Even though I'm not on TikTok, I'm on TikTok indirectly. So that is also something that we need to be able to make sense of. It's something that we also need to make sense of. So at the end of the day, we should not just focus on the people that are connected. We need to go beyond just those that are connected to say, even those that are not connected are also connected indirectly. And that is where you begin to understand the information ecosystem in Africa. It is a networked society. We network with each other, either on the streets, when we sit by the street corner, we talk about what we saw on Facebook, we talk about what we saw on TikTok, we talk about what we saw. So at the end of the day, the information circulates in the online world, out of the offline world, and vice versa. So that complex intersection between these various things is something that we need to be able to understand. I see that the technology is trying to do things here, but nonetheless, as I said, we can proceed. So the key issue that I'm trying to emphasize here is to say that understanding disinformation in Africa, ladies and gentlemen, requires a much more broader set of lenses. Because that's why I was arguing that most of the interventions that are coming from the global north are focusing more on what we need to do with big tech. I have no problem, obviously, with media literacy campaigns. But if we are talking about media literacy campaigns to people that have never been on social media, what are we doing, ladies and gentlemen? What are we doing, ladies and gentlemen? We need to understand our own ecology of information, sharing, seeking, and understand how do we get information as people, and how do we fact check and verify information as a people. And when we understand that, then we begin to say, what are the solutions that can help and work in Africa? And how do we move forward this particular conversation? Yes, big tech have to do a lot. No doubt about that. We need to make sure that there's platform accountability. But beyond platform accountability, my argument is to say we need to have other set of interventions that are specific to the African information seeking and sharing ecosystem. That way, we will then start making headways in terms of how we deal with issues. If the slides were, I wanted to show you a certain slide where I try to problematize what is really happening, especially with regards to electoral disinformation in Africa. In that particular slide, I try and show what happens before the elections, during the elections, and after the elections, and who are the actors that are involved in these disinformation campaigns. I used that particular slide that I wanted to show in one of the books that we are going to launch very soon. But I think the information, the system here is making it very difficult. But nonetheless, we need to move forward. Let me just, because I'm about to finish, let me just talk about AI. I think AI has entered into the ecosystem and made it even much more complex for us, especially in Africa. Why? Because, again, AI is mostly trained on historical data. Most of this historical data does not recognize us as Africans, and our information, our knowledge, our data is not part of it. And because of that, what we are likely to see in that particular space is that the same kinds of biases, pitfalls that I was talking about are likely to rear their ugly head again on this particular space. It's even worse in Africa, where in Africa we are seeing generative AI merging with social media. So, for example, we've got Meta AI. Meta brings its artificial intelligence on its platforms. Now you can go on Meta AI. Then you also have got Grok AI again, embedded again within social media. If there's garbage in Grok, we are going to get garbage out from Grok. That's how it's going to work. And mostly what we have seen, especially with the disinformation against this particular country, with Grok, we have seen that there's a lot of misleading information about South Africa that is actually being propagated through Grok. And again, it has to go back to the owner, obviously, Elon Musk, and his beef with this particular country. But it's very unfortunate that we find ourselves there. That now the technologies that we think and we thought that were going to help us to move forward are the ones that are reproducing the same kinds of problems that we are trying to deal with. It becomes a challenge. It becomes a challenge because instead of becoming an antidote, it is becoming a conduit through which false and misleading information about this particular continent, but also this particular country are being generated. So what are the solutions? What are the solutions? I think let me talk to the solutions and then conclude. What are the solutions? I think I have mourned, I've lamented a lot of things, but I just want to say, so what are the challenges? How do we move forward from there? How do we move towards a much more healthier, resilient information ecosystem? Ladies and gentlemen, the dominant approach to dealing with dis and misinformation in Africa has tended to become what I call very much more formalistic. We've got so many formal interventions. One of the formal interventions that we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, has been the use of laws. So they use legal approaches, come up with fake news laws, lots of fake news laws, pushing a lot of fake news laws. The other thing that we have seen is what we call educational empowerment, media information literacy campaigns. A lot of misinformation. But the problem which I have with media literacy campaigns is that they start from the wrong premise. Information poverty, that's the assumption. Africa is riddled with information poverty. There's lack of information. It's not really about lack of information in most cases. Sometimes it's about information overload. Sometimes it's about information becoming too much. How do we condense and make sense of this information? So if we start from an information poverty lens to understand media literacy and interventions, we are likely not to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we are seeing. The other formal approach that we have also seen has been the issue of technological approaches. Let's outsource technology to do the work for us. Content moderation. Let's do a lot of content moderation. Let's outsource. But as I've pointed out, if you look at the content moderation practices that are happening right now, Africa is more than 3,000 languages. But if you go to Meta right now, they only recognize 8 African languages. 8. Just imagine what happens to all this other misinformation that circulates in other vernacular languages. It's going through their gates, and there's nothing that is being done about it. 8, I'm talking about 8. And South Africa is actually lucky because it has got at least 2 out of that. isiZulu and Afrikaans. Those are the only 2. Imagine. And yet we are supposed to be doing content moderation. So there is a problem at that level. There is a lot of problem that needs to be fixed at that level. So that's why we are saying the challenges that we are facing are beyond just the technology. We need to deal with the language deficit issue. How do we translate our so-called low resource languages to become high resource languages like English and French? How do we do that? And I think that is a critical thing that we need to start dealing with. It's fine, don't worry, I'll be able to finish. The other issue is also what I call informal approaches. I've been a key advocate of what I call informal approaches to dealing with disinformation. And one of the key arguments that I make in what I call informal approaches to disinformation is to argue that if you look at what happens on Facebook, on WhatsApp groups, for example, if you see what happens in WhatsApp groups, there's a lot of verification that happens in those WhatsApp groups. People don't just allow you to share things and then you get away with it. We need to make sense of how people are already creating their own informal fact-checking initiatives within WhatsApp groups. And for me, that is where we need to focus on. Even within families, there are uncles, aunties that circulate, but there are people that would find a way to, a cordial, respectful way to correct the elders, to say, no, but you got it wrong. This is what is really happening. This is a regurgitation of what happened in 2008. It is not what is happening right now. We need to make sense of these informal social correction measures that are already happening even without the support of platform companies. When we begin to make sense of these informal approaches, then we begin to make sense of how complex human beings are able to deal with challenges in their own ecosystems without relying on external intervention. There's nothing wrong with fact-checking, ladies and gentlemen. But fact-checking is the challenge of reproducing the same kind of narrative, coming in as providing salvation. They are not providing salvation to Africans. They are not. Because Africans are not passive. They know what they are doing. They are only coming to assist us to make sense of our world and to make sense of the information ecosystem. We run the risk of reproducing what used to happen during the modernization era, where you think these people don't know anything. Let's go and civilize them. You are not coming to civilize Africans. You are coming to make sense of their information ecosystems. That's essentially what you are coming to do. So fact checkers must understand their role and not fall in the trap of becoming change agents. A call to action. What is my call to action? I think I've been told I've got 3 minutes to go. What is my call to action? I have a very simple call to action, ladies and gentlemen. We need to make sure that we understand the sociology of information seeking and sharing within the African ecosystem. If we start from that level, we will have better interventions going forward. Unfortunately, we are starting on a wrong footing. We have started on a wrong footing, and because of that, we have reproduced earlier mistakes that we made in the past. We need to understand, how do these people really seek information? Where do they get their information? Who are their trusted sources of information? And when we go there, we can then start making impact. Because if my trusted source is my pastor, and my pastor is not part of the ecosystem, of the challenge, of the issues that you're dealing with, you are not making headway to me. You are not likely to make sense to me. If my trusted source is my traditional leader, and you are not including the traditional leader in the ecosystem, it means you are not making sense to me. And as a result, I may not take seriously what you are saying. So we need to understand the sociology of information seeking and sharing within an African context so that we can be able to make sense and to come up with context-specific interventions. Ladies and gentlemen, as I have said, I don't have a lot in terms of my clarion call, but just to say, ethnographic studies rooted in African realities are desperately needed, especially at this time in moment. We need more and more ethnographic studies that are able to make sense of what really is happening before we transplant, cut and paste, and impose without understanding what really is happening. I think with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me stop there. But just to emphasize, I've got this book that is coming up in the next, I think, three, four months. This particular book, I have not spoken to issues that it addresses, but some of the issues that the book is going to be addressing are these issues that I was talking about. In this particular book that I did with Alan Noriarwa, we argue that there is a lot that still needs to be done to understand disinformation on African terms, and not on any other terms, but on African terms. And we push for an argument to say we need to make sense of disinformation campaigns in our own context, in our own locus of enunciation, and then bring on board other borrowings that we can get from other continents just to make sense of also, because we do understand that we live in a globalizing, digitizing, but also interconnected world. Sometimes misinformation that starts in Indonesia finds itself in South Africa because of the porous nature of the digital borders. We do acknowledge that. But even then, it always takes the context in which it finds itself. That is what needs to be understood. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I thank you.
Thanks very much, and don't go away. All right, so to try to summarize what was an incredibly, I think, useful and nuanced conversation about disinformation in Africa's hybrid information ecosystems, the idea that a pure focus on digital platforms should also consider our sociological space, African oral traditions, faith and community networks, to look at a sociology of how people seek and share information becomes a key part of how we address this as a problem in our local circumstance, and we need researchers that engage at this level of discussion. I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. We are already running behind because I know we started about 15 minutes late, so I will take a round of questions. Do a show of hands. I'll take 3. And then we'll see if we have time for another round. Okay, I see Sia. Is that Richard Stupar? Yeah. Oh, hi Richard. Okay, so Sia, Richard, anyone else? User, and is there anyone else? So 1, 2, 3, and then Guy makes 4.
Should I go?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Prof, thank you so much for the great talk. Very interesting ideas coming through. I've got a quick question, and it's something that came up, I think, yesterday as part of the conversations as well. And really you have then done a great job of historicizing disinformation all the way to propaganda campaigns.
think let's answer that one rather than muddy the waters with 3 different questions, because I think they're all going to be very different and very complex.
All right. Thanks a lot, Prof. Charlie, for that particular question. Very interesting. I deliberately avoided talking about legislating because I know it's a very slippery slope to navigate, especially in a context where some governments can actually use legislation as a way to then curb other inalienable rights that people should enjoy. I think what we have seen over the last couple of pretty much 10 years in terms of what has been happening in terms of legislating, the problem has tended to be focusing on the user. It's always the user, not the platform. We tend to focus on the user to say the person who has generated is the one that should be liable. But I think with that particular approach to legislating, we run the risk of failing to understand that now with AI, for example, how do you know that this is the originator of this particular false and misleading information piece? And for me, that is the challenge that governments have to be navigating going forward, to say, how do you apportion liability? Intermediary liability in terms of focusing on platforms is easier because you say you are the one who hosts this particular content, so you must be responsible for making sure that the ecosystem is clean enough. But how do you make sure that you focus on the user? And for me, that is where the challenge is. And we have seen it, especially during COVID. There were so many laws or statutory instruments that were passed across the continent where people were saying anybody who is going to be found to have willfully or purposefully circulated false information related to COVID is going to be fined, sometimes imprisoned. But how many people were arrested? If you ask me, how many? Didn't we see an avalanche of disinformation? So for me, I argue that that's why I was saying the human being is at the center of disinformation. I think making sure that we help human beings to understand the responsible uses of digital platforms or other platforms, it becomes essential. Because once we are able to do that, then we don't need the laws to then come in to remind us of what we are supposed to do. And I think for me, as part of what we are saying, media information literacy campaigns, that is what we should be inculcating from a young age to say, how do you responsibly use these technologies that have come to our shores? How do we use them responsibly? So that we may not then end up using the whip to make sure that we go back into line. We can only use the whip because we have failed at some stage. And even if we ask each other here, did anyone taught us how to use Twitter or X? Nobody. We just found ourselves there. Did anybody taught us how to use TikTok? Nobody taught us. We just found ourselves there. So that kind of digital citizenship is very important. For me, it is a very important intervention that needs to happen because increasingly the technology is becoming much more powerful, almost sentient, if we are talking about technology, AI, and what is going to happen with sentient technology if the people don't know the responsibilities that are supposed to come with using those particular technologies. So for me, I would try and avoid legislation if possible. Thank you.
I'm asking this for maybe 2 reasons. The one is, sort of, as you mentioned in your talk, there's never been a time where we lived in truth. That this has never been true.
Yeah.
So the change can't be that we once lived in truth and now we live in lies, right? The other is that a lot of the things that we think about when we think about disinformation, these are not like claims about the world that one could go to the world and test. So there are certainly that. So when President Magufuli says you could cure COVID using these terms, demonstrably this is not true. But if we talk about things like white supremacy in the US, or we talk about ethnicities and like xenophobia, these are not
Yeah.
accusation. And so if the problem is not one of truth or falsity, it's one of kind of we've lost hegemonic control over construction of norms and over social reality. What does that tell us? Like, where does that take us for a solution? Because even if, as my colleague here mentioned, the legal route is maybe we don't want to legislate the truth, right? That's
Yeah, that's true.
Even if, in a looser sense, even just to say, oh, we need to reestablish a hegemonic control over the construction of reality, that also feels a little bit like a very icky political pathway. But if not that, how do you respond to a problem that control over the social construction of reality is now fractured? What does one do in response to that?
Awesome. Thanks. That's a very fascinating question. Certainly, what is at the center of what we are finding ourselves is the struggle for the hegemonic control of the truth. That's why you can hear people like Donald Trump saying, I believe in alternative facts and all these kinds of things. It's all about trying to assert that, to say that truth with the capital letter T, and maybe the truth with the small letter t. How do we make sure that the two come together again? I think we are thinking of going back to the golden old days. I don't think even in that golden old days that we want to talk about, that ever existed. It's just so, I think it never existed. But what matters at the end of the day is that the kinds of facts that are in the public or that are circulating in the public sphere must enable people to have an informed choice, but also make sure that they understand how they can find each other in that particular environment that they find themselves. So for me, it's about how do we make sure that we acknowledge that, yes, we cannot go back to that golden age that we talk about, even if we never existed in that age. How do we assert ourselves? How do we make sure that the truth is just not about false or truth, but it's about this is what exactly is the step. For example, if we are saying there is a war in Israel, or there is a war in Gaza, for example, I think we should all at least agree that there is something that is going on there. The way how we then define what is happening there then becomes a way of either it's a way how we approach that particular thing, but the understanding that there is a war, I think should be the bottom line. And for me, that is what we should be struggling to get to say we still need a shared sense of this is what is happening in the world. And I think probably we are losing that because all of a sudden people can say there's nothing that is happening. It's not a war. It's not a war. There's nothing that is happening. Let's just move on. Nothing is happening there. And then it then becomes an epistemological debate from different kinds of standpoints, people trying to push their own narratives. But ultimately, as you have said, I think to assume that we are going to have one hegemonic truth again, I don't think we are going back there. Probably we need to lean on what Michel Foucault was saying to say, maybe we are living in an era of multiple regimes of truths. But in these multiple regimes of truths, but there is one common understanding of what really is important and what is really happening right now. And I think for me that is important. Thank you.
You and then Guy, and then guys, we are short on time, so I really have to call it.
Yeah.
Please feel free to speak to Prof. Mare afterwards, but otherwise people are going to have tea and they're going to want to lynch me. Okay, so yes, sir.
Wonderful presentation, Professor. So I have one question. I have a comment and a question. So you often talk a lot about disinformation in relation to media and politics. So, but in your presentation, you have actually highlighted that even ordinary citizens can become the biggest drivers of disinformation. So my question to you is basically, because one of the examples that I can come up with, I remember during the Cape Town taxi strikes, there was a lot of things posted online, DNs shared on social media, which were disinformation. So how do we deal with that? And also, do you think that now ordinary citizens are becoming a biggest drivers of disinformation?
Indeed, just the long and short of it is certainly yes, the ordinary person is one of the key drivers. As I've said, human beings are infrastructures through which disinformation circulates, is produced, circulated, and consumed. And we are seeing that quite a lot, especially amongst ordinary people. As I have pointed out, we live in communities where either the person who is pushing the disinformation campaigns or narratives could be in a public figure, like religious leaders, sangomas. There are so many people that play a mediatory role, especially in our lives. And these people tend to give fuel to this disinformation ecosystem, especially in an African context. We have seen a lot of that. And it continues even to this very day, that we continue to see that even amongst ourselves, ordinary people, even as friends, you see that you are in a WhatsApp group, there's one friend that keeps on circulating false and misleading information, and it happens. So human beings certainly are at the center of it all.
Okay, and I think the last question is for Guy.
Guy, yes.
Thanks, that was really super. I do like this black box concept, and I like your reference to religion, because religion is the biggest black box in all. Nobody knows the mind of God. And so you have to accept there's a black box if you believe in religion. I think that there seems to be the three black boxes that worth nuancing. The one is the social media, obviously, that you spoke about. And that is a black box that's potentially the most manipulative because of the algorithms and also because of information operations, fake identities, and so on. But people in that mess there allegedly do trust influencers. So that's an interesting thing. They don't see influencers as part of a black box. They see influencers as frank and authentic, although it's performative. The second black box, I think, is the social messaging that you spoke about.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting here, the provenance is very clear because you tend to know the people in your WhatsApp group. Except that in India, I think one can see the manipulation of WhatsApp through BJP activists, for example, those groups. So that's another interesting issue, to what extent people are aware that what is the black box there, and also the way in which your data from WhatsApp is feeding into the other meta platforms that are designed to feed you content and manipulate. The last thing I was going to say is ChatGPT. This is the super magic box, black box.
Yeah.
Because it presents as being a human
Yeah.
that you can trust.
Yeah.
That you can dialogue with. And you say please and thank you and all that. So those are three black boxes. Now, I do think that when you come to Africa, in general, of course, we know it's much less mediatized than much of the rest of the world. And so I think that what I'd say there, and I'd be interested to get the thing, that people in Africa also have such experience of mass communications as taken with a pinch of salt because of the abuse of mass communications, taking back to colonialism. And so I wonder to what extent then in Africa identity is more upstream, certainly to mass communication and digital communication, and primary in that way. And so what this means, I think, is to what extent those who want to manipulate information in digital media in particular only succeed if they play on identities.
Yeah.
Because if they just play without identities, identities are upstream in that sort of sense, especially in Africa. And so it's interesting. My last thought, which I'd love you to comment on, is this question of media and information literacy. And if we see this picture that I've painted as people get their identities from a lot of things, their church, their family, their gender identity, their ethnic identity, language, what. If that's the case, then to what extent is media information literacy about, in particular, digital communications, which are particular black boxes? To what extent is media information literacy got possibility for people to reflect on their identities, take charge of their identities more actively? Because if everything is just kind of So, not if a limited part of your identity is the result of, or affected by black boxes, to what extent can people's exposure to digital communications open up their identities a bit more, and possibly in ways which are not manipulative by the factors or by those who abuse them?
Thanks a lot, Guy. Very, very interesting observations. I take them very much with gratitude. Thanks a lot. I think for me, what I see is that identities in Africa are cracks and crevices that are used by disinformation merchants to push their different kinds of narratives. Be it race, especially in South Africa, we see that quite a lot, race. We also see ethnicity sometimes, class sometimes, but also many other things, ageism and all these other things. The merchants, they know, they ride on what I call the cracks and crevices of society, where things that we are so sensitive about. Those are the ones that they push, and even anti-foreigner, us versus them kind of narrative. Again, we mobilize that. It's very much easy to mobilize, because then it can have a lot of people that can push that kind of narrative. So I think, as you have rightly pointed out, if media information literacy campaigns are going to have a lot of impact, they need to help us to understand that. If we are going to reach social cohesion as part of that kind of intervention, we need to be able to reflect on ourselves to say, who are we? What is our role? And how do we make sense of the world in which we find ourselves? And then how do we know that this information is being packaged in such a way to divide us rather than to keep us together? And I think then we can then start making a lot of impact. Rather than just to say, we are just having a media and information literacy, want to show you how to spot what is false and what is truth. And I think that is too elementary. It assumes a lot of us are passive. We don't know what we are doing, but we are much more complex human beings. And I think if we understand that we are much more complex, we bring on board different kinds of identities, different kinds of knowledges, then we can start taking people seriously in terms of the interventions that we are putting. Thank you so much, Guy.
Okay, thank you. Two pieces of housekeeping. Is Seitati Lehotla here? Seitati? Okay, so all the stuff that you see designed, that wonderful board outside that people are taking selfies, and the name tags and the books, this is Seitati, that's our student. If you want to employ it, also, if you are a member of the WhatsApp group that we set up for the conference, I think only 80 people have signed up, but are a member of the WhatsApp group, please note we've circulated a call for nominations for the Sacomm Exco. If you want to nominate yourself and nominate somebody else for those positions, I think there are 9 positions, Sisanda, because the AGM is going to be held later today. Please do so, okay, using the link. Otherwise, have a good tea, and thank you for a fantastic session, Prof. Mari.